So while temperature is the most important of the physical features of the environment, there are several others that also have a big impact on living things. The first of these is wind. So wind is actually created by temperature differences. As heat heats up melting snow or something like that, it can create a wind. And then it's also related to temperature because it actually just amplifies the effects of temperature differences. So, for example, you've probably heard the word wind chill and the way that wind can amplify how cold it feels. So it does this by increasing heat loss. And so it makes things evaporate more quickly or transpire. That's the loss of water out of living things more dramatically. And so that's where the wind chill comes from. It can also make a hot day feel even hotter in some cases. Not always. Sometimes the wind feels cooling, but if you think about in like a desert area, you have things called the Santa Ana winds, for example, which are hot, dry winds that actually dry things out a lot and can make it feel even more like scorchings. That can affect organisms because it's now hot and dry. It also intensifies ocean waves, so that affects things that live in the ocean. And so organisms that live in water that have to attach, like these two different examples of organisms that attach, have to deal with windy conditions because they can affect how well they can hold to their to the strata that they live on. So what does a windy environment look like? Well, in Colorado, that's the plains or the eastern plains. And so organisms that are well adapted to windy conditions are things like grasses. So you don't see a lot of trees in really high wind areas because it can be difficult for trees to survive high wind conditions. So water availability is another physical feature of the environment. Water is required for fundamental cell purposes, so it fills the cell. It's giving structure not just to the cells, but also to the organism. So at the tissue level, our tissues are filled with water. And we're also using water for all of our basic physiological processes. So our organs use them to carry out organ function like digestion, for example. And our chemical reactions oftentimes directly use water and certainly are needing to happen in water. So this very specific requirement. Plants are particularly susceptible to water availability in the environment. This because they're sitting in the soil, for example, and they need to be able to get water right where they're sitting. So plants have different adaptations related to water availability. And so think back to the plant chapters where we talked about roots, for example, and stems and leaves having veins to distribute water. They also, if you think back to previous biology classes, they have, for example, the stomata that close and open to hold in water or to let vapors out when it's not hot. So they are well adapted for environments that have less water. Certain plants are, like cactus. Animal distribution is also affected by water availability, but for different reason. It's because they follow where the plants are. So animal distribution is affected because plant distribution is affected. And so why is that? Well, animals can move for water, so they don't have to be reliant on the water being right where they're sitting the way that plants are. But they do have to have food, and so they have to be where the plants can grow so that they can eat the plants. A camel is a desert animal that has some really unique adaptations, specifically because they live in a region that has extremely low water. And so you may know that they actually store water on their bodies in order to be able to survive sort of traveling between water sources. So in the wild, they would have to travel between one oasis and another, and they'd have to have enough water to make it between those. So they still need water on a regular basis, but they can go longer than a lot of other organisms. Okay, light availability is an additional feature of the environment that's very important, especially for plants. So light is an absolute requirement for plants. Why is that? Well, as you hopefully remember, they're autotrophs, and they are able to make their own sugars using light as a source of energy in the process of photosynthesis. And so they have no other way to get energy besides light. So this is an absolute need for them. Now, how much light they need is really dependent on the species. So some plants are adapted for shade, and so they can do well with less light than other plants. In aquatic environments, water absorbs light, so light shines onto the water, and the water only makes it a certain depth. And in fact, a lot of the energy is lost even within 1 meter. And then there's totally no light left once you get to 100 meters. And so beyond that area, beyond that depth, there's no photosynthesis possible. And that's what's called the photic zone, this 100-meter depth in which light can still reach. And so you really see very few aquatic plants beyond that that are always there. So how are animals influenced by light? Well, much like with water availability, they're dependent on where plants are, so they have to eat plants. And so light availability limits animals because it limits plants. All right, salinity is another physical feature of the environment. This is saltiness. Now, when you hear salt, you probably think like table salt, sodium chloride, but this is actually a reference not just to sodium chloride, but a whole host of other mineral salts that might be in the soil or in the water. So this can be things like phosphate ions, nitrogen-based ions, magnesium ions, calcium ions, zinc ions. There's all kinds of different ionic compounds that are present in water and soil that contribute to the overall saltiness. And so this is obviously big in aquatic environments, though we also see that soil contains water as well and has these salts that are dissolving into the water that's mixed with the soil. So in animals, this saltiness has a strong effect for organisms that live in water. So for example, fish. So freshwater fish have a challenge in that they must constantly eliminate water. And so if you remember back to tonicity, you have a hypotonic condition in freshwater. So the outside of the fish, so here's my fish. If they're in freshwater, then the environment is hypotonic and the water tends to flow into the fish through osmosis. And so they would explode if that just always was happening. And so the fish have to have special mechanisms to send water back out. So osmosis is always drawing water in. They have to have special mechanisms to eliminate water. Marine fish have the opposite problem. So here's the fish. In the ocean, the environment is hypertonic, so they tend to lose water out of their tissues. And so they're constantly having to bring in water more, and then they have to have a special process that eliminates salt that's in that water. So a whole extra step to deal with this issue. So for plants, some plants are just adapted for living in high salt conditions. So soil can be naturally high in salinity. So think, for example, along the ocean. And so if you're along the ocean, there's sand, and that sand is a very salty environment. You're not going to see a soil there. Basically, it looks like sand because plants aren't living there and dying and creating soil. And then as you get further from the ocean, there's maybe a couple more things that can live in that saltiness. And so you see, for example, dune grasses and grasses that can survive in that relatively salty, sandy soil. So they can have some tolerance for that. You can end up with saltiness in soil like in a less natural way. So that's what these are examples of. So in a place like Colorado that's very dry and arid, it is a common practice nowadays to draw mineral-rich well water up. And so in Colorado, the aquifer is really low. It's really far below the ground. It's like 600 feet below the ground. And so it's a really ancient bed of water underneath the ground, and it's been down there with rock for a really long time, and so it's accumulated a lot of minerals in it, so mineral ions, so read salts, okay? And so this mineral-rich well water is relatively salty compared to, say, river water. And so when they spray that down onto fields, especially if they use a sprinkler, a bunch of the water evaporates and just leaves behind salt. And so over time, you get saltier and saltier soil. And this is actually a problem in some of our agricultural areas, like the San Luis Valley in southern Colorado. And it's really challenging because the only way to solve the problem for your crops is to keep watering, like, because you're trying to dilute the salt. But then every time you're watering, you're adding more and more salt. So it's a vicious cycle. Over-fertilization also causes excess salinity. So when people apply fertilizer, so if you go to the store and you buy fertilizer for your grass or for your plants, it's typically a mineral salt. That's the form that it's in. And so that salt can actually cause the soil that you apply it to get too salty, again, over time if too much is given. And so, as I mentioned, there are some plants that can tolerate higher salt, and those are called halophytes. But for the most part, plants cannot handle it because they lose water. So just like the fish, they would lose water if it's too salty, and that's a big problem for them because they don't have any mechanisms to deal with that. Last physical feature that we'll talk about is pH. pH, remember, is a read of H+ concentration. pH 7 is approximately neutral. Oops, sorry, not approximately, but pH 7 is neutral, and that's approximately what pure water is. Now, rainwater actually is not pure water. It has lots of different ions in it that it's gathered when it's up in the clouds. And so it's generally a little bit acidic, around pH 5.6. Most plants grow best at a little bit of acidic, so pH 6.5. And so rainwater being a little bit acidic helps the soil be a little bit of that extra acidity. And that helps, that right level of pH helps the plants, that's what they're adapted to, that helps them extract the water and minerals that they need from the soil. If you have a pH that's off from that, it can really affect plant growth. And one of the ways that it can affect the plant growth is that it actually damages the bacteria. So the bacteria that fix nitrogen, so they actually turn nitrogen into usable forms, and plants need nitrogen in order to grow. And so if the bacteria can't do this reaction, then the plants will struggle. The other place that pH is really a big issue is in water. For aquatic organisms. So the optimal pH for freshwater fish is somewhere between 6 and 9. If it's outside of this pH range, again, it can be damaging to their tissues or to their proteins. So too acidic denatures and too basic denatures. You may have heard of acid rain. Acid rain, we've already said that rain is always a little bit acidic, but if the rain has a pH less than 5.6, so even more acidic, that's usually caused by human interference, or it's unnatural causes, basically. And the big one is fossil fuels. So the burning of fossil fuels contributes things like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide to the atmosphere. And when those are in the atmosphere, they react with the rainwater, and that acidifies the rainwater. And so the problem with that is it then makes the rivers and streams have more acidic water in them. And so that has the impact on organisms that live in those rivers, lakes, and ponds. It can also directly affect the plants that it falls on. So if it's acidic enough, it can actually kill leaves, like burn them the way an acid would, or gradually change the soil pH so much that the plants can't survive. So that's the importance of pH.